we wanted to start this conversation by showing you a short film. It's 9 minutes. It's based on the series In the Shadow of the Pyramids. And this photographic series, I mean, Laura will be able to will describe it much better than I will now, but just in terms of the time span, it started in 2005 for 10 years up to 2014. And this film is largely based on this photographic series. So Laura, for people who don't know what happened in Egypt 10 years ago, what should they be aware of before watching this film?
Hi, Julie. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. So basically the series started in 2005, and the images that you're seeing are from 2005 to 2014. They're not in any order of date, but the video that you're seeing actually is a video that I created for my installation at the Photographers Gallery for the Deutsche Börse Award. So you're going to see the images, and you're also going to hear two layers of sound. One is sounds from Tahrir Square during the protests, which was a people's movement. Thousands of people took to the streets demanding that the government step down, and they, calling for a democratic change of governance. And you also hear my own voice relaying some of the motivations and personal narratives of why I'm there, what it is that I'm trying to say, and what it is that I'm witnessing. So that contextualizes the whole thing.
Thank you so much. And just if everyone could just turn their camera and their sound off, that would be amazing. So there is no distraction while we're watching the film. Let's start now.
Standing in the shadow of the pyramids, the beginning meets the end. Here I choose to bury my most valued possession, in a place I once called home. Standing in the shadow of the pyramids, the beginning meets the end. Here I choose to bury my most valued possession, in a place I once called home. My name is Laura El-Tantawy. I'm Egyptian. I can feel the thump of my heartbeat. Fast, faster. I'm breathing, sweating, suffocating. I'm screaming. I force my eyes open from nightmare to reality. Clock ticking. It's almost 4 a.m. A preoccupied mind disturbing a tired soul. I walk through the hallway to shake off my insomnia. The window, my hope. This is where I've come for a cure since childhood. A panoramic view over downtown Cairo. All the sleepless nights I've spent standing here. This is the window into my soul. In the far distance, I catch sight of my dreams. I returned home 2 years ago to find it's not what it used to be. 730 days and I'm still picking up pieces of myself. There are nearly 90 million people in this country. 90 million stories to be told. This is only one. It was just after sunrise had ushered in a new morning. I stood under Cairo airport's flickering fluorescent lights, my heart pounding ahead of what was about to happen. I knew my life was changing forever. My family surrounded me, my mother weeping, my father worried. This memory has guided my future. I've lived away from Egypt for nearly 2 decades, yet somehow a lot of me remain behind. Being far away yet so close leaves a strong imprint, a sense of love and loss all in one. took to the streets on January 25th, 2011. I had to be home. It was a moment when my past, present, and future came together as never before. In the square of liberation, I found dreamers, just like in the films, thousands of them. In Tahrir Square, I found myself alone. There's a lot of emotion in Tahrir, but some sadness is starting to. A young man told me he packed a small bag and told his family he was leaving. He told them he was going to the square because he wanted a better future. I told them they may never see me again. I'm here until Mubarak leaves, and I know I may die fighting for it. This is not the story I set out to tell. My time covering Egypt since 2005, I've never seen the country so polarized and sharply divided across such a clear line. Are you with us or against us? How do you tell a story when the plot keeps changing? How do you feel, have empathy, and photograph when you don't understand what's happening anymore? Am I with them or against them? Every picture I take in Egypt has been part of a life document from my own. I photograph life. This is what's always inspired me. Now there's a fire raging. So many people have been killed. I've seen their blood seeping away. Now there's a red mound of hate. This country where for a long time I was seeing good over bad has finally pushed me into an intense darkness. Hope, fear, disappointment, joy, pride. This square has seen it all. I ache when they ache, cry when they cry, try to laugh when they try. In their faces I see my own. It's amplified. It's the kind of sadness that floats in the background, chokes you in the throat, hurts you deep in the gut. First time I saw a dead body was on the morning of July 27th, 2013. A pool of blood and the slippery feeling under my shoes. I remember thinking this is not where I want to be. I thought facing the dead would make me cry. It didn't. More than 2 years ago, I stood in Liberation Square, one small person among hundreds of thousands of other small people, all fighting as if we were one for something really, really big. This feeling of euphoria has now dissipated. This was meant to be a story about searching for familiarity in a country I've long held on to through childhood memories. It's hard realizing home is no longer home. I've lived off my expectations for its potential, piecing together memories from my childhood. My name is Laura El-Tantawy. I'm Egyptian. Standing in the shadow of the pyramids, the beginning meets the end. Here I choose to bury my most valued possession, in a place I once called home.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Laura. It's just an incredible film. How does it feel to watch it now after all this time?
I think now I try to avoid watching it. It's too emotional. Yeah, like I was trying to look at my phone, look out the window. I was just trying to detach. I think hearing my voice and hearing the sounds of Tahrir Square and kind of relaying those memories, well, it takes me back to that place, but it also takes me back to images and everything. That whole work meant something when I made it. Like I made this video in about 2016, so even 5 years ago, there was a certain euphoria and joy and something that was attached to it in the creation of it, that now it's become quite sentimental, but it's also quite heavy. And this is because of how the narrative around the protests and that political change has been changed in Egypt.
And I just wanted to contextualize a little bit more and explain also the reason why those photographs are displayed alongside the Capas, because it might not sound as an obvious combination before we enter into the subject in more details. So the exhibition in Cork Street is about documenting conflict and looking at Capa and El-Tantawy's work to think about how the various ways in which photography can document conflict and how the narratives have evolved and changed across the years. And what I find extremely interesting and powerful in those images, we have 6 of them are currently on display in Cork Street, is this kind of painterly and very sentimental and expressive narratives that you are engaging, Laura. In connection to the video, I think it's even stronger. And I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit how, in relation to the video, how the images were selected and how do you piece them together, because it looks like a visual diary. I mean, some images were taken in 2005. So for instance, the image here of the bus ride. So before the revolution started, if I remember well, when you came back to Cairo to photograph your family, your home, it was a completely different project than what it ended up being. And I was just wondering if you could talk about this journey and this project, how it started, what did you want to photograph at the beginning and how it changed?
Well, I think one of the main differences is that, well, between me and like Robert Capa, of course, he's iconic as a conflict photographer. Like I looked at his pictures when I was studying photography, and I think when I began engaging with photography, I wanted to do conflict photography actually, because it seemed like what better way to engage with the world than show the ills of the world to the rest of the world. to show what's happening. So for me, that was the motivation at the time. But when the protests happened at Tahrir Square, I never felt that I was documenting conflict. And I think if ever at that point I still had that motivation to document conflict, I very quickly realized I'm not the kind of person that can do that, because I'm not somebody that's a frontline photographer. I mean, Capa was a frontline photographer. You can see that in his images. Whereas for me, I was telling my own story as an Egyptian. And I think that comes across in the feeling that you see in the images. So I was never documenting somebody else's war, even if it's an emotional or intellectual war. I was documenting my own generation story. And that personal element, I think, is very dominant in the work. And like, I didn't even think that when I was doing it, but in hindsight, I think this is what you kind of see. But when I returned to Egypt, I actually initially went back because my maternal grandmother suddenly passed away. And she was kind of the voice that was always telling me, come back home, we miss you, life is here, that kind of stuff. So she was my connection to home. So when she passed away, I felt like I really owe her, going back and trying to reconnect with my home and my family, and also with my own identity, because I had lived away from Egypt for about 10 years at that time. So I came back a changed person, but I also came back to this country where the landscape was shifting. There were already protests in 2005. There were talks at that moment that President Mubarak was going to hand down power to his son, who was actually a banker who used to work in Canary Wharf here in London. And he quit that job and he went back to Egypt, and his father wanted to sort of pass the baton over to him and say, it's now your cake. You could do whatever you want to do with it. So even as early as 2005, people were out on the streets saying, we're not going to let you do that to the country. This is not a monarchy. We need to have a democracy. So between 2005 and 2011, when the actual people's movement happened, there were 6 years there where all Egyptians knew that something was coming. We just didn't know when. So in a way, in those years, I was already photographing Egypt, but there was always this looming feeling in the background that something is happening. You could just tell it by people's body language, All it really took was observing how people walked on the street, their demeanor, the slumped shoulders, the sense of how people didn't have any control over the country, no control over their fate, essentially. Simple things like the idea of dreaming and thinking about what they can achieve seemed like things that they couldn't really do because their fate was controlled by someone else, in this case, the government. So all of these things and all of these thoughts were always in the background of what I was doing. So of course, when 2011 happened, it was this massive explosion where thousands of people took to the streets all over the country. And they were like, it's now our moment. We need to change the course of where this country is going. And in that sense, the course of our future. So this is a very long answer.
No, it's
what you asked me.
It's great. It's really interesting. And I just wanted to look at the book a little bit better, because in more details, because thinking about how those photographs circulated from being taken in the street to then being in a book to then being exhibited in in the gallery space, in the museum space. I'm just thinking about those different contexts in which the images are being seen and how the context affect their meanings as well. So I'm just gonna, yes, that's a recent publication. So it was recently published again for the 10th anniversary. Is that something that you had in mind at the beginning? Did you want to republish it again, or how did that idea?
No, never. I never thought I would republish the book. I think when something is done, it's done, and you can move forward and just take away what you want to take away and then move on to something else. But this work keeps pulling me back. Every time I feel like it's done, I've moved on, I'm now doing something else, it keeps pulling me back in a way that I just can't resist. So 10 years on, and I think reflecting on how those 10 years have been really, really critical in changing the narrative around the revolution, it really became a moment for me where, as someone that documented this historic moment, seeing how those images stand today, 10 years on, with all the brainwashing, all the activists and people who took part in making those protests happen 10 years ago are now either in prison, or they've been labeled as spies, or they've been forced out of the country. So in that sense, the images that I made were now being presented as images of a moment of chaos that sprang the country into a direction that it wasn't supposed to go in. I was left thinking, what does that mean for those images that I made, which I thought were historic and I thought were really relevant for our collective history as Egyptians. So in that sense, I decided to revisit the book 10 years on. But I never thought this would happen. And I always work with small publications. So it's it's an edition of 500 books. I could have made many more copies of the first edition, but I just feel like it's better to make work in small editions, especially as a self-publisher.
Yeah. And I was very intrigued by the cover of the book as well, because the family narratives and the dialogue between past and present for the country, but also in your family history, is very much there in the book. And I was wondering, how did you choose this specific cover before we look at the book in more detail?
Well, so this is actually the first book.
Okay.
I don't know if you could see it very clearly. So we tried to work with the same idea, so the same size and everything, but we tried to relay sort of what you're going to encounter inside this edition of the book. So the first edition is one where you're working with what's happening in the present and with memory, and the memory comes through my childhood images. So the cover of the first book has those two images juxtaposed, one that I took and one of my family album. And in this new edition, what was really important was to work with the memory and how the memory is now encasing everything that's inside, because it's all now a memory. So that's why the book begins with the image of me with my father. I'm the tomboy at the bottom right there. And the back cover also has an image of my family album. And everything you encounter inside is what I witnessed.
I'm just gonna show just a couple of images, and those numbers refer to the date where the picture were taken, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, working with like book design and how you can bring the feeling or contextualize what you're trying to say with a book is something that I find very exciting when approaching a book. In this particular book, the history took precedent over the images, because when you actually encounter the book, all you see are folded images that are pages that are white. You don't see any images. You have to unfold them to kind of reveal that memory, reveal that image. So dig into the past. And we kind of codified the dates. So this is like the 25th of June, 2013 is when this image was taken. So you encounter the dates and the historical, the date, and then you see the image.
I'm just gonna show, just a few other examples. With also those family archives as well. Yeah.
And I think, again, also like, so this book, when you first see it, it's all just white. It's almost like there's nothing in it. And I think this is exciting because it's sort of like anti-photographic book to do in a way. So I think that was also quite exciting to approach the narrative that way, as though it's like a blank slate. We're starting from the beginning to a certain degree.
I'm just gonna, sorry, where's my, this is just a selection of works from the book, from the series. And what you just said about anti-photographic is, I just find it very, very interesting, because when, like, if we think like classically about documenting historical events, or even documentary photography, and this as a genre, where the photographer is supposed to be invisible, and the feelings of photographer are not supposed to be present in the image making. I mean, whatever, even if that's possible or not. But with your photographs, which are very painterly, very impressionist in a way, I find that just so interesting, because some images are very clear, some are a bit more difficult to understand, to pin down. I mean, people really have to think about what they are looking at. Was it part also of the process? I mean, it was something that, because you worked as a newspaper photographer before, so I guess this is a kind of different way of approaching photography.
Yeah, definitely. I think this project, and in doing it, I really discovered my identity as a photographer. And by that, I mean like my visual identity, how I see the world and how I want to engage with it visually. And what are the things that really attract me to photograph. I mean, I'm a people photographer, so I know that anything related to people, I'm really interested in photographing, because I'm just, really amazed by human behavior and expressions and body language. That all of that world fascinates me. But yeah, I think also part of that impressionistic language comes from the fact that I was always photographing for myself first, for my own memory. So I never really felt pressure from any direction that I had to create images in one particular way. I didn't really think about the audience, what the rest of the world was making of what's happening in Tahrir Square. I was always really engaging with my own narrative and what it is that I want to say. So that, that's extremely liberating. And it really allowed me to experiment and fail, and I failed a lot. And I tried again. And of course, then you have the editing process. So in that editing process, you select the images that really worked and ones that didn't. And I mean, by the time I came to publish the first edition of the book, I had thousands of images. I think the book only has about 110 pictures overall. So from those thousands and thousands of images, I made a lot of edits. And in doing that editing, I also decided what language I really wanted to show in the book, because not all my images were that impressionistic. Some of them were also very traditional in terms of photography wise, but that's not the language that I felt really told the story of what was happening in Tahrir Square. For me, it was about a moment of change, a moment of uncertainty, a lot of chaos, but also a very emotional moment. And for me, all of these things are not definite. There are things that are moving, they're blurry, they're shifting, they're not very clear. So for me, this is the only language I feel I could have really photographed the revolution in, because it was very true to me and how I experienced it.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the images now again, I mean, they seem so, I don't know, related to the body in some way. I mean, we can see you or feel you moving in the space. And but you were a photographer, but also a participant as well, which I think slightly changes also as well the way you apprehended those events, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was this is like the most difficult series that I've ever made, because I often had to make the decision between taking a picture and being an Egyptian and participating and protesting and chanting and talking to people and really enjoying this historic moment that we were all kind of participating in. So yeah, that was difficult. And of course, the photographer bit was always like, I need to document, this is important historically. So there was always this shift between, the photographer and the protester, which was quite interesting. Yeah.
And who is the little girl on the top right of the screen with the swing?
Someone I don't know, but I think there's perhaps a self-portrait of some sort there. I think, I definitely believe that the photographs that we take really say a lot about who we are. And we can see ourselves one way or another in the images that we make. I don't believe in this idea of neutrality and being like a fly on the wall. This doesn't exist. So I think in all the images that I made, I am present. And I don't mean that in an egotistical way. It's quite obvious in the color palette, the style. I am very present as a photographer, but I'm also very present emotionally. I can be any of these people, particularly in the protest images. anybody could be Safiya, the woman crying to a certain extent, because a lot of Egyptians were experiencing this emotion. But yeah, I think the picture of the girl is interesting. I just took it from the top of the building where I live, actually, and just photographed her.
It also brings a kind of hopeful and lighter dimension as well to the entire series, and I find the contrast and juxtaposition just so interesting. It's like reading a book, really, with images and different narratives and different storylines.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Yeah, and this was actually one of the earlier pictures that I took before the protests. And I wonder if some of that hope and positivity was there earlier on when I did the work, and then later on as things progressed, it took a sort of a darker tonation. Perhaps it is true. I've never really thought about that. But also the image with the red flower was one of the earlier images that I took, and I think there's something about life and, you know, in that image as well, that in the later images they're more darker.
And there are many very strong and powerful portraits of women as well in the series, and the one in the middle, I think you mentioned, was one of your favorites. And I was wondering about that specific topic, and if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Well, I don't know if it's because of the human emotion of it, like as a woman relating to another woman's emotions. Is that what made it more accessible for me? I'm sure there's some of that there. But yeah, I think part of it was also done in a very in a conscious way, because in Egyptian media, particularly since the narrative around the protests was changing as they were happening. In the beginning, it was a people's movement, a popular movement. Then it was a little, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood came in and they started to control part of the movement. So the media started to portray it as a movement where men were playing a dominant role and they were pushing women to the back. So women weren't really participating. So they were trying to basically question the validity of the movement that's being dominated by men, and women are not taking part in it. So as somebody that had the privilege and the ability to be there to photograph these events, I also felt that I need to show things the way that I'm actually experiencing them and seeing them. So I was photographing women, and at some point I stopped photographing men in beards because a lot of the Muslim Brotherhood members would have a beard, and I just wanted to show that there is diversity here. So you can't say this does not represent Egypt, because it does. So yeah, there were all of these things always happening, and decisions and thoughts that were behind the work and the selection of what I'm going to photograph and what I'm going to choose not to photograph.
And you were also photographing in the private and also the public space, right? I mean, I'm just looking at this image here on the left, with, I don't know what's floating in the air, but it's so different to the images in the street, but then they are connected by the book and by your narrative. So I was wondering about this one as well, and those more like intimate or more domestic, if I may say, images alongside those street ones.
Yeah, pretty much all the images that you see from an interior space, I believe they're all pretty much taken from my childhood home where I grew up in Cairo. So this is actually an image that I took from that flat in downtown Cairo, and looking out at, you know, a particular neighborhood in the city. And this is our laundry in the wind. And this is during, I think this was taken in March or April, because this is a month where we have these winds that come in from the Sahara Desert. They're called the Khamasin. And they come in and they paint the entire city in this orangey glow, and it's really intolerable to be outside. So this was taken on that day. And I think all the other images that you see from an interior space are taken from that same flat looking outside. In fact, one of the issues I had, I think, at the end of the work, is I felt like I didn't have a balance between inside and outside spaces. I felt like I was more of a street photographer because I was documenting the outside, but I didn't really spend as much time looking inside at the homes of Egyptians. But, you know, my home is representative of that. So I guess that's why most of the interiors come from there.
Yeah, and I guess in relation to your family story and this kind of domesticity as a theme. I mean, there are those family pictures taken from photo album which take place in the series, and there's just like a selection of them here. And the reason why I'm putting those images together is because you mentioned the theme of home as well, and that's something that I find so interesting in relation to this specific project and the way you approached it, because living outside of Egypt for, I don't know, how long did you live outside before coming back?
I think at that point about 10 years.
About 10 years, yeah. And in the video you mentioned that the place you went back to was not the same, that's the one you remembered. So yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about that, about this aspect of home and Egypt for you.
Yeah, I think it's something that's in all of my work. I'm always exploring home one way or another. And I think, I don't think, I know that this comes from the fact that I've always spent my life navigating two places. So that I was always in one home, but there was another home in the back of my head that I'm thinking about. So I was never really fully in one place. There's always this experience that I'm thinking about my family back home, or I'm thinking about my work in the other home, or my friends, whatever it is. So there's always this sense of displacement, emotional displacement somehow. And really, In the Shadow of the Pyramids was really about exploring that displacement and not making it a sense of displacement anymore, but coming to terms with Egypt, Cairo in particular, as my home and as a place where I can just be and exist and not even have to think about this thing anymore. And I think it was quite serendipitous that the protests happened, because what was really empowering for me is in Tahrir Square, everybody felt like they were displaced one way or another. So there was a sense of unity for me in that, in the conversations we were having. Even for people who never left Egypt, they felt like they didn't really have full ownership over the country. And this was the moment where they wanted to make home a real home. So this was, quite serendipitous that I found myself and my own story in everybody else's story that was there. But this theme of home is something that's definitely in this work, but in every other work I've done since.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about the images that are in the exhibition, if that's okay. And I'm just wanted to show this one because it's a big one in the window. And I was just amazed at the scale of them as well, because thinking that they just, again, the context in which those images are displayed, I mean, from a book, from the street to a book to those very large formats, almost like a painting, really. I'm just wondering about this specific scale, and why did you choose this specific dimension for those images?
Well, I think I always show this work in different ways. If I have the opportunity, I really like to show it as a projection because it's quite immersive with the same video and sound that you heard. I think it takes people into that space and they kind of feel like they're really living the story of what happened in Tahrir, obviously through my own narration. But I think it's nice to see them in frames as well, to kind of hold that moment still. For me, what's really exciting for me as an author is I make the books as an object that stays there for me in my own personal history. But exhibitions are really a way for me to engage an audience with the work. And so it's always exciting for me to see whatever opportunity there is to see how I can bring an audience into the story and engage them with it, whether they knew about it before or they didn't know, or whether they've seen the work before and now they're seeing it in a different way. So I think the size is a good way to also do it, because if you see this image small, it's a very different meaning than when you see it big. I think an image like this in particular, the bigger it gets, it almost like pulls you in a very different way than if it's small, it's quite precious. If it's big, it's overwhelming, and you really feel a sense of presence, like you're almost there. So I think this is what I think about in terms of sizes. But we selected the images together for the exhibition, and I was you know, this is one that I'm always really happy to show, because this is an image that represents the energy, the spirit, the passion of what was happening in Tahrir Square. It's all in this photograph.
Mm. It's it's in the vitrine as well. So the first one that people see before entering the space. And let me just switch. Yeah, this is the image. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind just describing a little bit what's happening in those 6 images before we answer any questions people have in the Q&A. I'm just saying that, again, repeating that there is this Q&A option, chat section at the bottom of the screen, so people can write their questions if they wish to write them down. But yeah, if you don't mind, it would be great to hear a bit more about the background story of each image is what we're briefly what we're seeing here.
Right. Well, I think this image was taken in 2013. And this was during a protest in Tahrir Square. I mean, at some point, these protests continued for about 4 or 5 years off and on. And Tahrir Square, which is in the center of Cairo, if you block Tahrir Square, you pretty much block a lot of Cairo, which is a very big city. It's, you know, it's a city of like 20 million people. I think it's the most populated, or one of the most populated in Africa. So if you block that Tahrir Square, you block the entire city. The whole city becomes paralyzed. So these protests were always happening. And I would basically just go on any given day or every day at some point and just walk around, talk to people. This happened to be that I got access to stand on the stage. So there would be the stage where people would go up, sing songs or give talks, or, you know, just try to fire people up to stay in Tahrir and continue with the protests. So I got up there and I just made some pictures, and this is one of the photographs that I made. And this was also at the time when local media was saying there aren't women in Tahrir Square, they're in the back and all of that. So women were definitely there.
Mm. Yeah, I love that picture very much. I'm just moving to the next one, which is this one, the bus ride.
Yeah, so this was when I first moved back to Egypt, and as a way of like familiarizing myself with the country, I would take these bus trips from Cairo to some other cities. So this was one where I was going to Siwa, which is an oasis in the desert. And yeah, basically this was a rest stop. It's like an 8 or 9 hour journey between Cairo to Siwa.
Oh, I think we're losing Laura. Oops. Sorry, everyone. Some technical issues here. I hope you can still hear me. Let me see. Sorry, I think Laura is gonna try to reconnect. Very sorry about that. In the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to write them down. Very sorry about this. There may be an internet issue. Well, I hope you're enjoying the talk so far.
Hi,
Back.
sorry.
Hi, you all right?
I have no idea what happened. This has never happened before.
No problem. No worries. I think we can't see you, but we can hear you.
Oh, can you see
Oh
me
yeah,
now?
yes, I can see you. Sorry. Yes, sorry. What were you saying about about this image?
Gosh, I think something happened with my router and it just went and it restarted. Anyhow, yeah, I think for me, I appreciate these images in my work 10 or 15 years on, looking back at them, and then just kind of trying to understand what was happening in that moment.
I'm just going to move to this one here, which we saw this one in the movie as well, in the film.
Yeah, so this was during clashes, and again, many clashes were happening. So this is me standing basically on a street, and this is the interior ministry, and you're seeing all of these are state security police and officers standing on top of on top of the interior ministry, which is very close to Tahrir Square, and basically firing tear gas and throwing rocks and all sorts of stuff at the protesters, because protesters were trying to storm the interior ministry.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that you don't know straight away what's happening is even more intriguing. I find this image so intriguing, with all of those silhouettes. When you hear what's actually happening, it completely changes the reading of the image.
Yeah, because you can imagine anything when you look at it. It could be protesters. You're not necessarily thinking if it's who it is. It doesn't really matter actually in this narrative. And I should say in the books, actually both editions, I don't really include any captions, because for me, that's not necessarily relevant. It's about the feeling of the images.
Yeah, this one of the silhouettes could be actually dancing.
Yes. Yeah, I never thought of that.
And yeah, there is also this one.
Yes, this is another one from my childhood home. Same window as the picture with the laundry in the wind, but this was a particularly dirty window. There had been rain and obviously lots of dust that accumulated on it, and this is just looking outside around sunset.
And what we see on the window, it's kind of black traces.
Yeah, they're basically like traces of dust and rain and stuff that had accumulated on the window. But I think it's quite a metaphorical image in a way as well. You know, looking outside through a very unclear, you know, vision of what's happening or what's about to happen.
Yeah, I mean, again, like it's really similar. It's so similar to a painting. I find it just incredible. And this one too.
Yeah, this is this is Tahrir Square at about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and there were several buildings around the square where photographers would go to the top and have access to the rooftop or one of the flats in that building, and you could go in there and have some rest or just sit down or use the toilet. And you could also have access to the balcony to photograph what's happening in Tahrir Square. So this is on one occasion, and these flats actually were the apartments, particularly one of them was the apartment where a lot of the activists were on Facebook and on Twitter, putting out the messages and tweeting to people and telling them what's happening in Tahrir Square. So they were very much like control rooms for what's happening in Tahrir Square. So they were very, very busy. And if you could get in there, you're lucky. If you couldn't, then you had to find another flat if you wanted to get that top view. But what's happening here is this is at 3 or 4 in the morning. People would talk to each other. You had, you know, a cross section of Egyptians from all across the country, farmers, doctors, teachers, artists, everybody was there, and everybody was talking to each other, trying to think, what's our next plan? What are we going to do? What did you hear on the news? Some people would be praying in one area, others would be singing. You know, everything was happening there.
You can really feel the energy. It's just incredible. And this is definitely the one we have as well, in the show.
Yeah, so this is the day where the current president, Sisi, issued a mandate that the first democratically elected president, Morsi, who was from the Muslim Brotherhood, would be forced out of power because he had basically, I don't really remember exactly the reason, but he had basically done stuff against the country itself. So he got people, he said, if you want to support me as Egyptians in getting him out of power, then you need to go out to the streets and show me. So thousands of Egyptians poured out to the streets again to basically say, we want Morsi to leave. We don't want him as our president. He doesn't represent us. And this was outside the presidential palace where Morsi was at the time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we went through all of them. Yes, we did. I'm just going to stop share my screen. And just in case anyone has any question, they can ask them in the chat section. But before they do, I just have one more question as well, if that's all right. When we spoke about this specific series, I mean, you mentioned something that was fascinating to me, was how important this specific event has been for photography in Egypt, and how it has changed not only the country, but also the photography as a practice. And I was wondering if that's all right, just to just come back to that specific topic and expand it a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Egypt always engaged with the arts, but mostly with sculpture, architecture, painting, music, film. Photography is kind of a fairly new and emerging. I think emerging is maybe not true now. It was true maybe more like 2 or 3 years ago. But what happened during the revolution is that a lot of Egyptians were in Tahrir Square taking pictures as well. A lot of the young Egyptians who are now working as photojournalists, working for newspapers, and some names that you might see doing work online or on their Instagram, a lot of them began their engagement with photography during Tahrir Square. That was a moment where everybody felt like we want to tell our own story, but also because it was a moment where nobody had problems with being photographed. Everybody wanted to be photographed at Tahrir Square. Everybody was happy. They wanted to celebrate, the moment. But photography has always been problematic in Egypt. I think historically, photographers misrepresented people. They promised them certain things and then they lied in the presentation when it was published in a newspaper or something. So there was always this suspicion around photographers. And of course now, if you photograph, you can basically get arrested. So now it's very, very dangerous. And you have to be very careful about taking pictures and how you present yourself. And you have to have a valid ID. You can't just be out taking pictures and pretending that, nobody's gonna see you, because there's people watching everywhere, and there's not secret service, but secret police everywhere watching, because the revolution proved how powerful photography was and how powerful documenting our own history is. And I think the government is very wary of that. But also how powerful photography is in documenting police brutality against protesters. That's why it became so dangerous, and it still is now.
And I mean, how challenging was it for you as well? I mean, with a camera on the street.
Well, it's always been challenging, but during Tahrir Square again, I always go out on my own to take pictures. I never really go with like a group of people. I don't like to work that way. But yeah, I would make friends with people. I would stand in one spot. I would, go by you just have to trust your instincts. And if you feel like a situation is not one that you should be in, then I just move away very quickly. But I always engage and talk to people. And I remember in one situation where I felt really vulnerable, I turned to someone next to me and I said, can you just make sure that if something happens that I'm going to be okay? And, so you just have to trust your instincts, and it's kind of, you're guided by it really as a photographer, but also in these situations.
And that's just an open question as well, just to conclude in case. It's more about photography as a way to change people's perception, and how successful can that be? And in the context of the Egyptian revolution, how powerful was photography in changing the storyline and making things change?
Yeah, it's a tough question because...
Sorry to end with, it's a very tough one.
No, it's okay. I think it's tough because I feel like the impact of the revolution and the protests is actually still happening now. We're still really seeing it. So I don't think it's over, even if it's 10 years on, and even if people don't feel as euphoric as they were back then. I think we're still feeling the shift, especially with the younger generation that emerged after the revolution. But I think the thing about photography is it allows everybody to tell their own story. And that's very, very empowering. So in the same way that I've done it, a lot of people can do that, even if it's just for the memory. You know, I saw a lot of couples there with their young kids, and I would ask them, why are you here? They'd say, I'm here for my child because I want them to see what's happening. I want them to witness this moment. And taking a picture is a very powerful way of holding that moment still, especially with things changing now, and just saying, this is what happened then, and this is what you can continue to fight for. So I think in that way, I can see photography being very powerful in changing people's perceptions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Laura. It was so great to speak with you.
You're welcome. Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me and for all these thoughtful questions.
It's a pleasure to speak with you. I should mention that the video is available to watch again. If anyone wants to see it again, it's on the Messens website, but also available, I think, on YouTube or on Vimeo. And Laura will also be part of a panel at the Frontline Club on Monday with photographer Gals Dulay and art historian Julian Stalabras talk about conflict photography today. So thank you so much, Laura. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.